Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. So this is a book review. I've read The Hours Before Dawn by Celia Fremlin. So this was published in 1958, but so much of this book resonated and could have been written today probably, apart from the lack of phones and the internet and social media. But everything else, almost, seemed pretty like it could happen today, and that's a little bit worrying. So I had read another Celia Fremlin book, The Long Shadow, around Christmas time, so last year, because it does say as like a top tagline, "Welcome to the Nightmare Christmas Holiday." I thought it would be more Christmassy than it was. It's just kind of set around Christmas, but I did like the writing, and so I decided to give another one of her books a try. So I went with The Hours Before Dawn. So she is an author of like psychological thrillers, but I suppose the question that you might ask about this book is how much of this book is actually a psychological thriller in the more traditional sense, and how much of this book focuses on the exhaustion of being a mother, and especially being a mother in the 1950s, but just really focuses on the life of this housewife called Louise. So Louise is a housewife in the 1950s who is exhausted by a baby that wakes up every night and then is awake for like half the night. She also has two other young children who are at school but do come home every day for lunch, which is also something that seems a little bit old-fashioned now. And then also she has to look after a husband who seems incapable of even making his own breakfast, which there are elements of that I think resonate now, and then there are elements that just seem a little bit ridiculous. So things have moved on. But for financial reasons, they take in a new lodger, and Louise finds her behaviour a little bit odd or inconsistent or even suspicious. But is that actually because the lodger is up to no good, or is that just because of her sleep deprivation? And that's kind of the big question in the book. But it's mostly explored. Well, the book mostly focuses, I think, if you counted the number of pages, on Louise and her life as a housewife. So there are a few themes throughout the book. So one of the themes would be exhaustion, or her exhaustion and her sleep deprivation. So for example, after falling asleep during and after an argument with her husband, I say argument, he's really just shouting at her because he's not very nice. She falls asleep fully clothed on a chair, and then when the baby does wake up, in order to prevent the others in the house from being woken by the baby's cries, she takes him out on a walk in his pram. She's practically falling asleep as she walks and ends up having to sit down on a park bench, and then she falls asleep on the park bench, you know, just out in the open with the baby. I will say, although the book and Louise the character focus on her lack of sleep as being the big problem, it seemed to me, and perhaps from a more modern perspective, that the big problem for her was the incredible lack of support that she gets in both a practical sense and also emotional sense from any of the other characters, especially from her husband, who is the person that you think should be providing her with the most support. So another theme that I would say that runs throughout the book is the unsympathetic nature of her husband. So he leaves everything to her, everything domestic is left to her. We don't really see any of his work responsibilities, and he just leaves the house and goes to work, and so it could very well be that his job outside of the house is incredibly stressful and takes up a lot of his physical and mental energy. The book is really focused more on the domestic sphere, so we just see that in terms of the domestic, he leaves everything up to her, cooking, cleaning and looking after the children. Even on the weekend when he's at home, he takes himself away to have his quiet time and then still leaves Louise to look after the children. So at the start of the book, Louise is at a clinic with a midwife, and she finds that the nurse is dismissive of her concerns around the baby's waking, but she does, there's like a quote at the beginning that, where is it? It felt like the nurse might know what you could say to a husband when he shouted at you in the light of the crazy dying moon, "For God's sake, make him shut up. I can't stand it any longer. Make him shut up." So there's kind of the point that a theme that runs through the book is that the husband is frustrated and angry at the nighttime wake-ups, which is understandable, but he's almost blaming Louise and expects her to deal with it and solve the problem herself. Then another character that pops in and out of the book is Louise's mother-in-law, who's an interesting character, and almost would have been nice to maybe explore her character a little bit more, because she's very unsympathetic but also quite understandable. She basically has no desire to look after or help with any of the children, because she considers that her time raising children and looking after children is done now. She's raised her children and now they're grown up, and now she shouldn't have to do that anymore. So for example, she refuses to get a bigger car because then she might be required to take the children on days out. She often seems like very just unhelpful and unsupportive of Louise, who's clearly struggling throughout the book. But then at the same time, she, the mother-in-law character, has gone through all that Louise is going through, and you can understand why she wouldn't want to do it again, especially as she would have been a mother presumably in like the 20s and 30s, when it would have been even more difficult in terms of the amount of labour that would have been required in like maintaining a home and keeping things clean and tidy and stuff. As well as looking after her husband and children, though, Louise also has to navigate the judgment and opinion of her neighbours, and so that is something that's a little bit different about the book, I think, because of the setting of the 1950s, is that Louise knows her neighbours, which, I mean, we don't really know our neighbours very well, and I don't think people are as friendly or familiar with their neighbours as they used to be. So there's Mrs. Phillips, who keeps threatening to lodge a complaint because she can hear the baby crying so often. Whether that's less out of concern for the baby's welfare and more because it's a nuisance to her and that she's just being disturbed by the noise of the baby. Then you have Mrs. Morgan, who seems very sympathetic to Louise, but she's a gossip, and Louise is aware that she's probably talking about her as much as she's talking to her. So she's not a great friend. And then you have Mrs. Hooper, who consistently manages to get Louise to babysit. She also has a baby of roughly the same age. And she's quite an interesting character as well, because she's considered to be a progressive parent. And I do think that's quite funny, because a lot of the progressive parenting is probably the type of parenting that I'm trying to do. But it's perhaps conceptualised a little bit different. But it's interesting to think that the discussion around, you know, progressive parenting, or what type of parent you should be, that exists now, existed like 50, 70 even years ago. I forget that the 50s were 70 years ago. But she is a progressive parent, so she's encouraging her children to be more independent. But at the start of the book, Louise has a thought. Her internal monologue is that she wishes that Mrs. Hooper's children were independent in a way that didn't require the neighbours to feed them so often. So Mrs. Hooper is encouraging her children to be independent, but still continually wants Louise to babysit them. I just found that quite funny, but it just goes to show that she's not really getting a lot of support herself from other people, and it's just this continuous, she's been asked to help other people. Another theme that ran throughout the book was Louise's loss of self, which I think is something that's very relatable to a lot of women now when you become a mother, because your thoughts and your feelings and your needs get pushed to the side as you have to you know, devote your energy to looking after somebody else. So she refers a few times in the book to not really knowing how she feels about things anymore. So when she's on a fairground ride later on in the book, she becomes aware that she isn't enjoying it or not enjoying it. She isn't enjoying it or she's scared of it. She isn't really feeling either of those things. She doesn't know if she's enjoying it or not, because she's actually split in three, and she's actually with each one of her three children. And then there's a passage on page 102, which I did mark with a flag because it just summed up so much about when she accidentally overboils the eggs. So she says, "Bother, all the eggs would be hard by now, and Marjorie was the only one who liked them hard. Harriet liked hers soft, and Mark liked his very soft. As to Louise herself, she had long forgotten which way she liked them. It made the housekeeping that much easier if there was one person out of the 5 whose taste didn't have to be considered. To neglect one's own taste was more labour-saving than any vacuum cleaner, and it was a form of neglect about which no one would call you to account. Your husband wouldn't demand buttons on it, your children wouldn't hurt themselves on it, or be made late for school by it, and it wouldn't pile up against you like dirty nappies. Or would it? So the point there is, I mean, it's just about boiled eggs, but it's not just about boiled eggs, that she has given up having her own tastes and preferences so that it's just easier for her to not to have one person out of the 5 in the family that she doesn't need to consider the feelings on, and that nobody in the family is going to complain about the fact that she's not considering her own feelings, because no one is really considering her. And I just thought that summed up so much, and I really just thought it showed Celia Fremlin as being this amazing author, to my mind, but also that she really understood the character as well. And I think she wrote the book after going through a period of sleep deprivation with one of her own children, so she probably did understand where Louise, the character, was coming from. So a lot of the book is about motherhood, but there is also the thriller element to it. So the thriller element is a little bit of a slow burn, which is interesting because it's not actually that long a book. It's only 200 odd pages, 240, something like that. So it's not that long, but it still manages to be a bit of a slow burn and then have quite a dramatic conclusion. So Louise is questioning from the start, who is this lodger that's come to stay in their home? Why would a supposedly successful, respectable woman in her early 40s want to stay in the spare room of this family home and be happy to stay there and not really ask too many questions about it, to never really complain about it? And how come Louise and her husband and a few other people seem to think that they recognise her from somewhere, but they can't quite pin it down? The mystery unfolds at quite a nice pace, so it's not drawn out for too long. I mean, again, the book's not very long, so it couldn't really be drawn out for that long. But I also didn't feel like it was rushed. I was able to figure out the direction that the book was going in, that the thriller element was going in around halfway. But that was fine by me. I think a lot of other people would probably have twigged also, but then I think some people wouldn't. And I think either way, it works fine. Like, you're not disappointed that you figured it out, and also if you don't really see where it's going until right at the end, I think you would be kind of surprised or even shocked, but I don't think you'd feel like you'd been cheated, that they've just thrown in something like weird at the end that made no sense. When you think back to what's happened throughout the book, it does all kind of add up. Ultimately, the lodger character is both unpleasant, dangerous, but also quite sympathetic, and I think Fremlin does actually do a good job of balancing all that, to the point where Louise, who is put into a dangerous situation as a result, actually does seem to understand and feel a little bit sorry for her because of her motivations and what's happened to the lodger character previously. So I think, again, that just shows the strength of Fremlin's writing, but also her being able to understand and relate to the characters that she's created. And I suppose you would think, well, she's created the characters herself, so of course she can relate to them, but I don't always think that's the case. I don't think authors necessarily, I think they sometimes create characters that they just can't, understand or appreciate. I really, really liked this book. I liked the other Fremlin book, The Long Shadow, but this one did resonate with me more. And there's another one called Uncle Paul, which I plan to read in the next few months, which I think may be her most well-known book, but to be honest with you, I'd never actually heard of her. And so it wasn't until I was looking up her other books that I kind of discovered that Uncle Paul might be a little bit more well-known. They've actually been repackaged. So this one I bought new from Waterstones, and so the 3 books, The Long Shadow, The Hours Before Dawn and Uncle Paul, have all been repackaged, so they all have this style of cover. The Long Shadow has the tagline, "Welcome to the Nightmare Christmas Holiday." Uncle Paul has the tagline, "Welcome to the Nightmare Summer Holiday." And then The Hours Before Dawn says, "Welcome to the Nightmare That Never Ends," I think, if I'm remembering correctly. Stupidly, I decided to buy this second hand. That wasn't stupid. I'm trying to buy more second hand books. But stupidly, I failed to buy the correct cover, the cover that I actually wanted, so that I had like a, you know, a matching set. And so I'm slightly kicking myself. But thankfully, the contents of the book were really good. So I'm not kicking myself quite as much. Anyway, that's my review. I really liked and I do recommend this. And also I do recommend the Long Shadow as well. And I'll let you know about Uncle Paul when I've read it. Let me know what you think in the comments, both of the book and the video. And give me a like and a subscribe.